After my husband's affair with my best friend and losing everything, my job, my home, even my sense of worth, he told me I'd never be nothing but a bitter old woman living on scraps. At 62 years old, living out of a rundown motel called the Desert Rose Inn on the outskirts of Tucson, I found a dusty leather suitcase shoved under my bed with my name written on a yellowed tag in handwriting I recognized immediately. Inside was $100,000 in cash bundled in rubber bands, a first-class plane ticket to Savannah, Georgia, and a handwritten note that made my hands tremble so hard I nearly dropped it. Dear Margaret, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. When I arrived at that address 4 days later, standing before a massive Victorian house with peeling paint and overgrown gardens, what I discovered didn't just change my life, it revealed a decades-long conspiracy that had stolen everything from me, including the truth about how my sister really died. 10 months ago, I had what everyone called a good life for a woman my age. I was married to Richard for 37 years, working part-time at the public library in our suburban neighborhood, and my best friend Diane had been by my side since we were young mothers raising toddlers together. We had Sunday dinners, book club meetings, and that comfortable rhythm that comes from knowing someone's quirks better than your own. Richard worked in pharmaceutical sales, traveled frequently, and we'd settled into that quiet kind of marriage where passion had been replaced by routine. Our daughter Lauren was grown with kids of her own in Seattle, calling every Sunday like clockwork. I thought I knew exactly how the rest of my life would unfold: grandkids visiting during summer, retirement trips in our RV, maybe volunteering at the church food bank. I had no idea that every single piece of that life had been built on lies so elaborate they'd take me years to fully understand. The day everything shattered started like any ordinary Thursday morning. I'd taken the early shift at the library and came home around 2 in the afternoon, planning to start dinner before Richard got back from his sales conference in Phoenix. Diane's car was in our driveway, which wasn't unusual since she had a key and often stopped by to borrow things or drop off casseroles. But when I walked through the front door, I heard sounds coming from upstairs that made my stomach drop: laughter, intimate and familiar, mixed with voices I knew better than my own heartbeat. My legs moved on autopilot up those stairs, even though part of me wanted to turn around and pretend I'd heard nothing. When I pushed open our bedroom door, there they were, tangled in sheets I'd washed just that morning, looking not guilty or ashamed but irritated that I'd interrupted them. Richard didn't even scramble to cover himself. Diane just sighed like I'd walked in on something mundane. "Margaret, this isn't what it looks like," Richard said, which might be the most insulting thing anyone's ever said to me, considering what I was staring at. Diane pulled the sheet up slowly, deliberately, with this expression on her face that I'd never seen before, cold calculation mixed with something almost like pity. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said, as if there was a good way to discover your husband and best friend had been betraying you in your own bed. The calm in her voice was worse than screaming would have been. I stood there frozen, my purse still on my shoulder, car keys digging into my palm, trying to process that this moment was real and not some nightmare I'd wake up from. Richard started talking about how things between us had been dead for years, how I'd let myself go, how Diane understood him in ways I never had. Every word felt like a knife, but what hurt most was seeing Diane nod along, agreeing with his assessment of my failures as a wife. I left that house with nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back. I couldn't breathe in there another second, couldn't listen to them justify what they'd done, couldn't watch them exchange those knowing glances that told me this had been going on far longer than just that afternoon. I drove to my daughter Lauren's voicemail because she was at work, then to my brother's house, but his wife Sandra made it clear after 3 days that I needed to figure things out and couldn't stay indefinitely. That's when I learned how fast your support system crumbles when you actually need it. Friends from church were sympathetic for about a week, then started avoiding my calls. My cousin Patricia let me stay in her guest room for 2 weeks before her husband complained about the awkwardness. Everyone had opinions about what I should do, but nobody wanted to actually help me do it. Within a month, I was living at the Desert Rose Inn, a weekly motel that smelled like cigarettes and defeat, wondering how I'd gone from middle-class stability to this. The divorce happened faster than our wedding had. Richard hired some shark attorney named Preston Blackwell who made it his mission to paint me as an unstable woman who'd neglected her marriage and driven her husband into another woman's arms. My court-appointed lawyer, a tired man named George Simmons who handled too many cases and cared about none of them, barely put up a fight. Judge Patricia Morrison seemed to have already made up her mind before we even entered the courtroom, nodding along with everything Preston said while dismissing my testimony as emotional exaggeration. Richard got the house, the savings, the retirement accounts, everything we'd built together over nearly 4 decades of marriage. I got a small monthly payment that barely covered motel rent and ramen noodles. Diane sat in the courtroom during the proceedings, holding Richard's hand, wearing this sympathetic expression that made me want to scream. She'd even brought me a casserole to the motel once, acting concerned about my well-being while sleeping with my husband in his bed every night. The cruelty of that gesture still burns. Looking back now with everything I know, I can see exactly how they played me for 37 years. Richard and I met at a hospital charity fundraiser back in 1987, introduced by his colleague Marcus Webb who worked in hospital administration where my sister Eleanor was a nurse. At the time, Richard was charming in that easygoing way that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. He asked thoughtful questions about my work as a paralegal, remembered small details from our conversations, and pursued me with just enough persistence to feel flattering without being pushy. We dated for 18 months before he proposed at a restaurant overlooking the city, with my sister and Diane already at a nearby table to celebrate with champagne. It felt like a fairy tale, like I'd found my person. Now I know that meeting wasn't coincidental, that everything about our relationship had been orchestrated for reasons I was only beginning to understand. My sister Eleanor was brilliant, the kind of person who could have been a doctor but chose nursing because she wanted more patient contact, more human connection. She worked in oncology at Mercy General Hospital and loved her patients fiercely, advocating for them even when it made her unpopular with administrators. In the months before she died, Eleanor had been agitated about something at work, making cryptic comments about pharmaceutical companies and patient safety that I didn't fully understand at the time. She'd started keeping detailed notes, taking files home, making phone calls late at night that she'd end abruptly when I walked into the room. When I asked what was wrong, she'd say she was handling it, that she just needed to document everything before she went to the proper authorities. I assumed it was some standard hospital politics, nothing that would put her in actual danger. 3 weeks after she told me she'd scheduled a meeting with a medical ethics board investigator, Eleanor's car went off a bridge on her way home from a night shift. The police called it a tragic accident. She'd been tired, the roads were wet, she'd missed the curve on that dangerous stretch of highway where 2 other people had died in the previous 5 years. Her funeral was massive, packed with patients and their families whose lives she'd touched, colleagues crying into tissues, administrators giving speeches about what an asset she'd been to the hospital. Richard held my hand through the whole service, whispering comforting words, helping me manage the logistics of grief. Diane organized the reception, brought casseroles for weeks, listened to me cry for hours about losing my only sibling. They were both so supportive, so present, so concerned about my well-being. I never once questioned their motives or wondered why they were so invested in keeping me stable and distracted during those awful months. I never thought to ask why Eleanor's notes and files had disappeared from her apartment before I could go through her things, or why the hospital suddenly stonewalled when I tried to get information about what she'd been investigating. My daughter Lauren was 8 years old when Eleanor died, too young to fully understand why Mommy was so sad all the time. Richard stepped up beautifully during those dark months, taking Lauren to school, helping with homework, giving me space to grieve while keeping our household running smoothly. He suggested I quit my paralegal job to focus on healing and being present for Lauren, and it seemed like wise advice at the time. We could afford it on his pharmaceutical sales income, and the flexible schedule would let me be a more available mother. Looking back, I can see how that decision isolated me, made me financially dependent, removed me from professional networks and the confidence that comes from earning your own paycheck. But in the fog of grief, it felt like love. It felt like a husband taking care of his devastated wife, and I was grateful for it. Diane became even more essential to my life after Eleanor died. She'd been a friend before, someone I knew from the neighborhood and PTA meetings, but grief bonded us in ways that felt unbreakable. She was there for every milestone of Lauren's childhood, school plays, soccer games, graduation parties, often more reliable than Richard with his frequent business trips. We had our Thursday wine nights that became sacred, where we'd talk about everything from our marriages to our dreams to our frustrations with aging and invisibility. She knew about every argument Richard and I had, every insecurity I felt about my changing body, every worry about whether our marriage had lost its spark. I told her things I'd never told anyone else, believing she was my person, my chosen sister after losing my real one. Now I know she was reporting every conversation back to Richard, helping him manage me, keeping tabs on whether I suspected anything or showed signs of asking dangerous questions about Eleanor's death. The years blurred together in that comfortable suburban way, holidays and vacations, Lauren's college graduation and wedding, the arrival of grandchildren who filled my heart with purpose again. Richard's career flourished. He climbed the ranks at Meridian Pharmaceuticals from sales rep to regional director, bringing home bonuses that funded our retirement accounts and the RV we planned to travel in someday. We moved into a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood, joined a country club, became the kind of couple other people envied at church socials. I volunteered at the library and eventually took the part-time job there, needing something of my own even if it was just shelving books and helping elderly patrons with the computer catalog. My life felt small but sufficient, predictable but peaceful. I had no idea that every piece of that piece had been carefully constructed to keep me compliant and silent about things I didn't even know I should be asking about. Richard traveled constantly for work, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks per month, visiting hospitals and clinics throughout the Southwest to pitch Meridian's latest drugs to doctors and administrators. He'd call every night from hotel rooms, telling me about boring dinners with physicians and exhausting presentations, asking about my day and Lauren's kids with what seemed like genuine interest. I never questioned where he really was or what he was really doing. I never wondered why Diane often had convenient excuses to check on me during his trips, keeping me company so I wouldn't feel lonely or have too much time alone with my thoughts. The manipulation was so subtle, so consistent over decades, that it never once occurred to me to doubt either of them. They'd built a prison around me so comfortable I didn't even know I was trapped until the day I walked into my bedroom and saw them together, and even then, I didn't understand the full scope of what they'd stolen from me. The Desert rose and charged $220 per week for a room that barely qualified as habitable, with water-stained ceiling tiles, a bathroom where the grout had turned black with mold, and a mini fridge that buzzed so loudly I had to unplug it at night to sleep. Room 11 became my entire world, a space maybe 12 feet by 15 feet containing everything I owned after Richard's lawyers had finished with me. I had a suitcase of clothes, a box of photo albums I'd grabbed from the house during my supervised visit to collect belongings, my laptop, and a growing sense that I'd been erased from my own life. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, gray hair I could no longer afford to color, deepening lines around my eyes and mouth, a defeated slump to my shoulders that I couldn't seem to fix no matter how many times I reminded myself to stand up straight. My daily routine was pathetic in its simplicity. I'd wake up around 6, make instant coffee with the room's tiny coffee maker, and spend 3 or 4 hours applying to jobs online, library positions, administrative assistant roles, anything that might hire a 62-year-old woman whose most recent work experience was part-time and whose references would likely include a vindictive ex-husband. The rejection emails came fast when they came at all, most places simply never responding to my applications. I'd started doing freelance data entry work through websites that paid maybe $8 an hour before fees, hunched over my laptop at the wobbly desk by the window, squinting at spreadsheets until my eyes burned. On good weeks, I might make $150. On bad weeks, barely half that. It wasn't enough to escape the motel, wasn't enough to afford anything beyond survival, but it kept me from being completely destitute. Meals became an exercise in creative poverty. I lived on ramen noodles, dollar store pasta, canned soup, and the occasional rotisserie chicken from the grocery store markdown section that I'd stretch across 4 or 5 meals. I stopped buying coffee out, stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely essential, learned exactly which gas station had the cheapest prices and which grocery store ran the best sales. Every expense required calculation. Could I afford shampoo this week, or should I stretch the bottle another 7 days? Could I justify spending $3 on a salad, or should I stick with another can of beans? The library where I'd worked let me come in to use their computers and printers for job applications, and I'd time my visits to coincide with the free coffee they put out for patrons, drinking as much as my nervous stomach could handle because it was free and something other than instant crystals dissolved in tap water. The loneliness was almost worse than the poverty. My daughter Lauren called less and less frequently, our conversations becoming awkward and strained. She loved her father, had a hard time believing he could be the villain in this story, and her husband Derek made no secret of his opinion that I must have done something to drive Richard away. When I tried to explain what I'd walked in on, Lauren got uncomfortable and changed the subject, suggesting maybe I should talk to a therapist about processing everything in a healthy way. The implication was clear: I was the problem, the bitter ex-wife who couldn't move on, the embarrassing mother she had to make excuses for to her friends. She sent money once, $500 that I knew came more from guilt than genuine concern, and I'd spent it so carefully it had lasted 6 weeks. But the financial help was nothing compared to what I really needed, which was someone to believe me, to be angry on my behalf, to acknowledge that what happened to me was genuinely cruel and wrong. My former friends had all taken sides, and none of them chose mine. The church ladies I'd served with on committees stopped returning my texts. The book club I'd attended for 12 years suddenly had no room when I tried to rejoin after moving to the motel. Diane, of course, was everywhere in my old circles, at the grocery store, at the pharmacy, at the coffee shop I used to frequent, always with Richard, always looking happy and settled, like she'd simply stepped into the life that had been mine and found it fit perfectly. Once, I saw them at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, Richard's arm around her waist in the casual proprietary way he used to touch me, both of them laughing at some shared joke. Diane saw me standing there with my reusable shopping bag hanging empty from my hand, and for just a second our eyes met. She didn't look guilty. She looked satisfied, almost triumphant, before turning her attention back to Richard and the organic tomatoes they were examining. The night I found the suitcase, I'd been at the Desert Rose for 5 weeks and was starting to seriously consider just disappearing entirely. I had nowhere to go, but nowhere felt like an improvement over room 11. I'd been lying on the bed scrolling through my phone, looking at photos of my grandkids that Lauren posted on social media since I rarely got to see them in person anymore, when my charging cable slipped off the nightstand and fell behind the bed. I got down on my hands and knees to retrieve it, using my phone's flashlight to see into the dark dusty space between the bed frame and the wall. That's when I saw it, a large leather suitcase shoved far back against the wall, covered in dust and cobwebs like it had been there for years. There was a faded luggage tag attached to the handle, and when I pulled the suitcase out and wiped the dust away, I saw my name written in handwriting that made my breath catch, Margaret Rose Bennett, my maiden name, written in Eleanor's distinctive script with the elaborate capital letters she'd always used. My hands shook so badly I could barely work the combination lock on the suitcase, but taped to the inside of the luggage tag was a small key and a piece of paper with 3 numbers written in Eleanor's handwriting, 14-29-07. The lock clicked open on the second try, and when I lifted the lid, I had to sit down on the filthy motel carpet because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, bundled with rubber bands and organized in neat rows, more cash than I'd seen in my entire life outside of a bank. Tucked into a manila envelope on top of the money was a first-class plane ticket from Tucson to Savannah, Georgia, dated for 1 week from tomorrow, in my name. And beneath that was a letter, 5 pages written in Eleanor's handwriting, that began with the words, "Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm dead and you're in trouble. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you, but I can give you the truth and the means to fight back." I read that letter 3 times before my brain would accept what my sister was telling me. Eleanor hadn't died in an accident, she'd been murdered because she discovered that Meridian Pharmaceuticals was falsifying drug trial data and bribing doctors to prescribe medications they knew caused serious harm to patients. She'd compiled evidence over 8 months, documented everything meticulously, and planned to take it to federal regulators and the media. But someone at Meridian found out what she was doing, and they'd arranged her death to look like a tired nurse losing control on a dangerous road. The letter named names. Marcus Webb, Richard's colleague who'd introduced us, was Meridian's head of risk management, responsible for handling problems like whistleblowing nurses. Dr. Gerald Reeves, the oncologist Eleanor had worked most closely with, was taking kickbacks of over $50,000 per year to prescribe Meridian's cancer drugs despite knowing they were less effective than competitors' medications. And Richard, my husband Richard, had been assigned to marry me, to keep me stable and monitored after Eleanor's death in case she told me anything or left evidence I might find. Your marriage was never real, Margaret, Eleanor wrote in her precise script. Richard Davis isn't even his real name, he's Robert Davidson, and he's worked in corporate intelligence for Meridian since 1985. Everything about your relationship was constructed to control you, to make sure you never asked questions about my death or looked into what I'd been investigating. They needed someone close to you, someone who could report on your mental state and search your house for any evidence I might have hidden. I'm so sorry you fell in love with a man who was only pretending to love you back. I'm so sorry I couldn't warn you before they killed me. But I was smarter than they thought. I've hidden everything where they can't find it, and I've set up a way for you to access it when you're ready. The address in Savannah was for a property Eleanor had purchased under a trust 5 years before she died, a house that was being maintained by a property management company, waiting for me to claim it. She'd hidden her evidence there, along with instructions for how to use it, and resources to help me rebuild my life whether I chose to fight Meridian or simply disappear and start over somewhere they'd never find me. The $100,000 in this suitcase is just travel money, she wrote. Enough to get you to Savannah, set yourself up comfortably, and have cushion while you decide what to do next. The real fortune is in the trust one established in your name, stocks, bonds, real estate, worth approximately $3.8 million as of my last accounting. I worked overtime for years, invested carefully, lived frugally, all so I could make sure you'd be protected if anything happened to me. Use it to live well and free, or use it to bring these bastards down. Your choice, little sister. Either way, you'll never have to be afraid or poor or controlled again. I sat on that motel room floor until the sun came up, crying so hard I thought I might be sick, grieving my sister all over again while simultaneously being overwhelmed with gratitude for her foresight and love. Eleanor had known she was in danger, and instead of running or staying silent to protect herself, she documented everything and made sure I'd be taken care of if they succeeded in killing her. She'd hidden the suitcase in our mother's storage unit after she died, with instructions for the storage company to deliver it to any address I provided if I ever contacted them with a specific code phrase. The motel address must have been on some form I'd filled out, some official document that had made its way to the storage company's records, and they delivered it here without my knowledge, sliding it under the bed where it had waited for me to literally stumble across it when I'd hit bottom hard enough to notice. The letter ended with a postscript that hit me like a physical blow. P.S. Diane Kerrigan is Dr. Gerald Reeves's sister-in-law. She married his brother Tom in 1982, and when he died of a heart attack in 1988, Gerald helped support her financially. She was recruited to befriend you after my death, to monitor you the way Richard did, to make sure you had a trusted friend reporting back to them about your emotional state and whether you suspected anything. Every Thursday wine night, every heart-to-heart conversation, every secret you told her, she passed all of it back to Richard and through him to Meridian. I'm so sorry, Margaret. Everyone you trusted was working for them. But now you know, and knowledge is power. Use it wisely. Love always, your big sister Eleanor. I called the number Eleanor had listed for the property management company in Savannah at exactly 8 a.m. when they opened, and spoke to a woman named Patricia Chin who'd been waiting for my call for 14 years. Ms. Bennett, she said, her voice warm with recognition even though we'd never spoken before, your sister left very specific instructions for when you finally contacted us. I'm so glad you found the suitcase. When would you like to travel to Savannah? I'll make sure the house is fully prepared for your arrival, and I'll be there to meet you and provide you with everything Eleanor left in my care. I looked at the plane ticket, 6 days from now, and told Patricia I'd be there on that flight. She gave me her personal cell phone number, made me repeat it back to confirm I'd written it correctly, and said 5 words that made me cry all over again: "Your sister saved your life." The flight to Savannah felt surreal, sitting in first class for the first time in my life, drinking complimentary champagne I didn't really want, watching America pass beneath me through the window while my brain tried to process everything that had changed in 72 hours. I'd left the desert rose Inn without telling anyone where I was going, paid through the end of the week with cash so they wouldn't have my credit card on file, and packed my meager belongings into the same suitcase that had held my sister's gift. The money was in my carry-on bag, $100,000 in cash that made me paranoid every time someone looked in my direction, convinced TSA would think I was a drug dealer or money launderer. But I'd made it through security without incident, and now I was flying toward a future that felt both terrifying and full of possibility I thought I'd never have again. Patricia Chen met me at the Savannah airport holding a sign with my maiden name, and I liked her immediately, a petite woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense efficiency that reminded me of Eleanor. She drove me through Savannah's historic district, pointing out landmarks and talking about the house like it was an old friend she'd been tending for years. "Your sister purchased 247 Whitaker Street in 2009, Patricia explained as we drove down streets lined with massive oak trees dripping Spanish moss. It was a foreclosure, quite run down at the time, but she saw the potential and knew the neighborhood would appreciate in value. We've maintained it according to her instructions, keeping it secure, handling minor repairs, making sure it didn't fall into disrepair. She visited 3 times before she died, spending weeks here organizing everything she wanted you to have. She was meticulous, your sister. Everything is exactly where she left it." The house was a 3-story Victorian painted a faded yellow with white trim, set back from the street behind an iron fence and a garden that had been kept neat but not elaborate. It was beautiful in an old, slightly worn way, with a wide front porch and tall windows that promised high ceilings and good light inside. Patricia unlocked the front door and handed me a set of keys, explaining that the house had been updated with modern security and that she'd programmed my fingerprint into the system that morning so I could come and go freely. "Everything you need is here," she said, gesturing around the entrance hall with its gleaming hardwood floors and crystal chandelier. "Eleanor's instructions and all her documentation are in the library on the 2nd floor. The trust documents establishing your ownership of the house and the financial accounts are in the safe in the master bedroom. The combination is your birthday backwards, month to year. Take all the time you need, Margaret. Call me if you have any questions or need anything at all." After Patricia left, I wandered through the house in a daze, opening doors to reveal beautifully furnished rooms that Eleanor had prepared for me years ago. The kitchen was modern and fully stocked with dishes and cookware. The living room had comfortable furniture arranged around a fireplace, with built-in bookshelves full of books Eleanor knew I loved. The master bedroom on the 2nd floor had a 4-poster bed with fresh linens, a walk-in closet with clothes in my size hanging in neat rows with the tag still attached, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that made me want to cry because it was exactly the kind of bathroom I'd always dreamed of having. My sister had created a complete life for me here, anticipating everything I might need, planning for my comfort and security even though she knew she wouldn't be alive to see me enjoy it. The library was where I found Eleanor's real legacy. The entire room was organized like a law office, with filing cabinets full of meticulously labeled folders, boxes of documents stacked on tables, and a computer system that Patricia had kept updated and maintained according to Eleanor's specifications. There were patient files showing how Meridian's drugs had harmed people, internal company emails discussing how to hide negative trial results, financial records proving bribes to doctors, and most damning of all, audio recordings Eleanor had made of conversations with Marcus Webb and Dr. Reeves where they discussed handling her concerns before she could take them public. She'd worn a wire for weeks before she died, collecting evidence they had no idea existed. There were also detailed files on Richard, his real identity as Robert Davidson, his employment with Meridian's intelligence division, reports he'd filed about me over the years documenting my emotional state and whether I posed any risk of investigating Eleanor's death. The file on Diane was thinner but equally devastating. Eleanor had documented the family connection to Dr. Reeves, payment records showing monthly deposits into Diane's account from a Meridian shell company, and photographs of Diane meeting with Marcus Webb and Richard before she'd ever coincidentally befriended me at a PTA meeting. There was even a transcript of a conversation where they discussed how to position Diane as my grief counselor after Eleanor died, how to make the friendship feel organic and genuine so I'd never suspect she was reporting on me. Reading it felt like being murdered slowly, seeing how every relationship I'd valued had been manufactured to control me, how thoroughly they'd mapped out my life and circumscribed my possibilities. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible, not just killing Eleanor, but stealing decades of my life, making me love people who were using me, isolating me from any possibility of discovering what they'd done. But along with the evidence of conspiracy and betrayal, Eleanor had left me a roadmap for justice. She'd identified 3 federal investigators who were actively looking into pharmaceutical fraud and would be receptive to her evidence. She'd drafted legal documents that could be filed to reopen the investigation into her death. She'd even written out a media strategy, listing journalists who'd broken similar stories and would be interested in Meridian's corruption. "You don't have to do any of this," she wrote in a letter paperclipped to the action plan. "You can take the money, live in this beautiful house, and build a peaceful life where they can never touch you again. That would be enough, and I'd be happy knowing you were safe and comfortable. But if you want to fight back, if you want to make them pay for what they took from both of us, you have everything you need right here. Just know that if you start this fight, they'll come after you hard. They'll try to discredit you, intimidate you, maybe even hurt you. So choose carefully, little sister. Choose based on what you can live with, not what you think you should do." I spent 3 days reading every document, listening to every recording, mapping out exactly what Eleanor had discovered and how she documented it. And then I made my choice. I wasn't going to hide in this beautiful house and let them think they'd won. I wasn't going to let Eleanor's murder go unanswered or let Meridian keep hurting patients for profit. And I definitely wasn't going to let Richard and Diane live happily in the life they'd stolen from me without facing consequences for what they'd done. I called the first number on Eleanor's list, FBI Special Agent Victoria Ramirez in the Atlanta field office, and when she answered, I said the exact words Eleanor had coached me to use: "My name is Margaret Bennett. My sister was Eleanor Bennett, and I have evidence that she was murdered by Meridian Pharmaceuticals after discovering they were falsifying drug trials. I'd like to turn that evidence over to federal authorities and request witness protection while you investigate." Belle, before we continue to the next chapter, I want to say thank you for being here with me, sharing this painful journey that led to something I never expected: truth, justice, and a new beginning. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that it's never too late to fight back against those who've wronged you, please hit that subscribe button. It means everything to me and helps these stories reach other people who might need to hear them. And please, drop a comment below telling me what you think so far. I read every single one. Now, let's see what happened when I finally decided to stop running and start fighting back. Agent Victoria Ramirez arrived at the Whitaker Street house 36 hours after my phone call, accompanied by another agent named Marcus Holloway and a federal prosecutor from the Justice Department's Healthcare Fraud Division named Jennifer Park. They spent 11 hours going through Eleanor's evidence, asking me questions, recording my testimony, and photographing every document while maintaining expressions that shifted from skeptical to shocked to grimly determined. Victoria was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded me of Eleanor, someone who took her work seriously and didn't suffer fools or corruption. When she finally spoke after hours of silence, her words were measured but fierce. "Miss Bennett, your sister built an airtight case. This is some of the most comprehensive whistleblower evidence I've seen in 20 years with the Bureau. We're going to bring these people down, every single one of them, and we're going to make sure you're protected while we do it." The investigation moved faster than I'd expected but slower than I wanted. The FBI opened a formal case within a week, assigned a team of 8 agents to investigate Meridian Pharmaceuticals, and began the process of obtaining warrants and subpoenas. I gave multiple depositions, spent hours being interviewed by prosecutors, and had to relive every detail of my marriage and friendship with the clinical precision federal investigators required. They wanted dates, times, specific conversations, documentation of everything Richard and Diane had done over the years. I showed them the divorce records that proved how thoroughly I'd been financially destroyed, provided Lauren's contact information so they could verify my isolation from family, and walked them through exactly how the manipulation had worked to keep me from questioning Eleanor's death for 14 years. It was exhausting and humiliating, having to admit to strangers how thoroughly I'd been fooled, but Victoria never made me feel stupid. "You trusted people you loved," she said simply. "That's not a character flaw. That's being human. They're the ones who weaponized normal human trust." Meridian Pharmaceuticals must have gotten wind that something was happening because Richard called me for the first time since the divorce was finalized, his voice tense with a concern I now recognized as completely fake. "Margaret, I heard you're in Savannah. Are you okay? Lauren's worried about you." The phone call was obviously a fishing expedition, trying to figure out what I was doing and whether I posed any threat to them. I'd been coached by Victoria on exactly what to say. "I'm fine, Richard. I inherited some property from a distant relative and decided a fresh start might be good for me. Tell Lauren I'll call her soon. Keep it vague, keep it casual, give them nothing to work with." After I hung up, Victoria's tech team confirmed the call had been recorded on Richard's end, which meant Meridian was definitely nervous about something. "Good," Victoria said with grim satisfaction. "Let them be nervous. In 3 days, we're executing search warrants simultaneously at Meridian's headquarters, Richard's house, Diane's house, Dr. Reeves's office, and Marcus Webb's home. They won't know what hit them." The morning of the raids, I watched news coverage from the safe house where Victoria had moved me the night before, seeing aerial footage of FBI agents swarming Meridian's corporate offices with boxes of evidence, perp-walking executives in handcuffs past television cameras. Richard was arrested at his office at 6 a.m., looking genuinely shocked for maybe the first time in his lying life, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't quite process that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. Diane was arrested at her home, still in her bathrobe, and the footage of her being led to an FBI vehicle in handcuffs gave me a satisfaction I'm not entirely proud of but won't apologize for either. Dr. Reeves tried to run, actually got in his car and led police on a 15-minute chase through suburban Tucson before crashing into a telephone pole and being dragged out cursing and bleeding from a head wound. Marcus Webb's lawyer had him surrender at the FBI field office, walking in with the arrogant confidence of men who think their expensive attorneys make them untouchable. By noon, 23 people had been arrested, and the news was calling it the largest pharmaceutical fraud case in a decade. The media attention was overwhelming and immediate. My phone, a new number the FBI had given me, started ringing with reporters who'd somehow tracked it down within hours of the arrests. Cable news ran my old wedding photo next to Richard's mugshot, calling me the whistleblower widow who'd brought down a pharmaceutical giant, though technically Eleanor was the whistleblower and I was just delivering her evidence 14 years late. A reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution found the Whitaker Street house and knocked on the door for 20 minutes before Victoria had local police chase her off the property. My daughter Lauren called, finally, her voice shaking with confusion and anger. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Dad's been arrested for murder? The FBI is saying he's not even who he said he was? This can't be real." I had to tell my daughter that her father was a corporate spy who'd married me under false pretenses, that her entire childhood had been built on lies, that the man she loved didn't actually exist. She hung up on me halfway through the explanation, and I couldn't blame her. Some truths are too big to accept all at once. The preliminary hearing started 6 weeks after the arrests, and I attended every single one, sitting in the courtroom gallery where Richard and Diane could see me, wanting them to know I wasn't the broken woman they'd left crying in that motel room. Richard's attorney tried to argue that Eleanor's evidence was inadmissible because she'd obtained some of it through recordings made without consent, but the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Blackstone, shut that down quickly, noting that federal whistleblower protections covered Eleanor's actions and that the recordings clearly showed ongoing criminal conspiracy. Watching Richard's face as the judge destroyed his legal arguments was better than any therapy session could have been. He looked small suddenly, diminished, just a middle-aged man with thinning hair and expensive clothes who'd built his entire career on hurting people and was finally facing consequences. When his eyes met mine across the courtroom, I didn't look away. I wanted him to see that I'd survived him, that I was stronger now than I'd ever been when I believed his lies. The federal prosecutor Jennifer Park built her case methodically over 8 months, using Eleanor's evidence as the foundation and adding testimony from 12 other Meridian employees who agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. The picture that emerged during the trial was even worse than what Eleanor had documented. Meridian had falsified safety data on not just one drug but 17 medications over a 12-year period, bribing doctors at over 40 hospitals across 6 states, and systematically silencing anyone who threatened to expose them. Eleanor wasn't even their first victim. There'd been 2 other whistleblowers who died in accidents before her, their cases closed quickly by local police who didn't look too hard at the circumstances. The company had entire departments devoted to identifying threats and neutralizing them, with Richard's intelligence division being just one arm of a corporate culture that treated human lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of profit. Marcus Webb took the stand as a prosecution witness, having flipped on everyone else to save himself from a life sentence. He testified in excruciating detail about how they'd recruited Richard to cultivate me after Eleanor became a problem, how they'd manufactured our meeting and courtship, how Richard had reported back weekly on my emotional state and searched our home regularly for any evidence Eleanor might have hidden. Margaret Bennett was never supposed to be anything but a surveillance target, Marcus said, his voice flat and businesslike, as if he was describing monitoring equipment rather than destroying a woman's life. Robert, Richard, was supposed to keep her stable, prevent her from asking questions, and alert us immediately if she showed any signs of investigating her sister's death. The marriage was just operational cover, a way to maintain constant access. When it became clear after several years that she genuinely had no knowledge of Eleanor's investigation, the plan shifted to long-term containment. Keep her dependent, isolated, focused on family rather than career, so she'd never have the resources or support network to become a threat. Diane's testimony was worse because she tried to pretend she cared about me even while betraying me. I did consider Margaret a friend, she said from the witness stand, her voice quavering with what I'm sure she wanted people to believe was genuine emotion. I know what I did was wrong, but I was in a difficult financial situation after my husband died, and Dr. Reeves offered me good money to just spend time with her and report back on her mental state. It didn't seem like I was hurting anyone. She needed a friend after her sister died, and I was there for her. I listened to her, supported her. Yes, I passed information to Richard and the company, but I genuinely cared about her well-being. The prosecutor destroyed her in cross-examination, pointing out that caring about someone's well-being doesn't typically involve sleeping with their husband and helping steal their assets in a rigged divorce proceeding. Diane cried on the stand, but I felt nothing watching her tears. She'd cried at Eleanor's funeral too, and those tears had been just as fake. Richard didn't testify in his own defense, which his attorney probably considered wise since there was no possible explanation that would make him sympathetic. But I gave a victim impact statement that the judge allowed into the record, standing at a podium 20 feet from where Richard sat at the defense table, finally saying everything I'd held inside for months. You didn't just lie to me about who you were, I said, my voice steady despite my shaking hands. You stole 37 years of my life. You made me love a person who didn't exist. You isolated me from career opportunities and financial independence so I'd be easier to control. You slept in my bed, ate at my table, held my hand at my sister's funeral knowing your employers had murdered her. You helped raise my daughter, let her love you, gave her a false sense of security in who her father was. And when I finally discovered your affair with Diane, you didn't just leave, you systematically destroyed what little I had left, using your connections to rig my divorce and leave me destitute. You wanted me broken and silent and grateful for whatever scraps of dignity you allowed me to keep. I want you to know that you failed. I'm not broken. I found Eleanor's evidence, and I made sure everyone knows exactly what kind of monster you are. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, racketeering, obstruction of justice. Richard's face didn't change when the verdict was read, but his attorney slumped in his chair like he'd been expecting it. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, and Judge Blackstone didn't hold back. "Mr. Davidson, you have shown a callous disregard for human life and dignity that is truly breathtaking in its scope. You participated in the murder of a healthcare worker who was trying to protect patients. You married a woman under false pretenses for the sole purpose of surveilling and controlling her. You helped a pharmaceutical company poison people for profit. I'm sentencing you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, and I hope you spend every single day of that sentence thinking about the lives you've destroyed." I watched them take him away in shackles, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't even known was still tight with fear. Diane received 12 years as part of her plea agreement, Dr. Reeves got 18 years, and Marcus Webb, despite his cooperation, got 15 years because Judge Blackstone said his role in orchestrating Eleanor's murder was too egregious to deserve significant leniency. The Meridian executives who'd approved and directed the fraud schemes received sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years, with the CEO getting the longest sentence and being ordered to forfeit his personal assets worth over $40 million. The company itself was fined $2.8 billion and placed under federal monitoring for 10 years, with independent oversight of all drug trials and safety reporting. It was the largest pharmaceutical fraud settlement in history, and while no amount of punishment would bring Eleanor back or give me back the decades I'd lost, there was something deeply satisfying about watching these people face real consequences for once. They thought they were untouchable, protected by money and power and carefully constructed lies. They'd been wrong. The civil lawsuit I filed against Meridian, Richard, Diane, and 12 other defendants settled 8 months after the criminal trials ended, for $47 million. My attorney, a fierce woman named Caroline Shepard who'd taken my case pro bono because Eleanor's evidence had made her physically sick with anger, got the settlement terms sealed because I didn't want the specific numbers made public, but the money was more than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I'd started with $100,000 in a suitcase in Eleanor's $3.8 million trust, and now I had enough to fund the kind of justice work Eleanor had died trying to do. The money felt heavy with responsibility, like Eleanor was trusting me to use it the way she would have, protecting people, exposing corruption, making sure her death and all those years of my stolen life actually meant something beyond just personal revenge. The first thing I did with the settlement money was establish the Eleanor Bennett Foundation for Pharmaceutical Ethics and Patient Safety, a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating drug safety concerns, supporting whistleblowers in the healthcare industry, and providing legal assistance to people harmed by corporate fraud. I hired a staff of 12 people, investigators, attorneys, patient advocates, and set up offices in Atlanta and Savannah with satellite locations in 3 other cities. Victoria Ramirez agreed to join our advisory board after she retired from the FBI, bringing her expertise and contacts to help us identify cases where patients were being harmed by corporate malfeasance. Within the first year, we'd opened investigations into 4 other pharmaceutical companies and helped 3 whistleblowers bring evidence to federal authorities without ending up dead like Eleanor had. It felt like finally giving my sister's death a purpose beyond tragedy, like making sure her courage actually protected people the way she'd intended. My relationship with Lauren was harder to rebuild than any foundation or organization could ever be. She struggled to accept that her entire childhood had been a lie, that the father she'd loved and trusted was essentially a fictional character her real father had been playing for profit. We started family therapy, just the 2 of us, since Richard obviously wasn't available and Lauren's husband Derek had strong opinions about me destroying the family, with a therapist in Seattle who specialized in trauma from parental betrayal. The sessions were brutal, listening to Lauren describe feeling like her whole identity was built on sand, wondering if Richard had ever actually loved her or if she'd just been another part of his operational cover. "Did he even want to have me?" she asked during one particularly painful session, her face wet with tears. "Or was I just something he had to do to maintain his fake life?" I couldn't answer that, because I genuinely didn't know. The Richard I thought I knew had seemed like a devoted father, but I also thought he was a devoted husband, and we all knew how that had turned out. Gradually, slowly, Lauren and I found our way back to each other. She brought my grandchildren, Emma who was 8 and Jackson who was 6, to visit me in Savannah, and we spent a week showing them the historic district, eating pralines, and building sandcastles on Tybee Island. The kids were too young to fully understand why Grandpa was away or why Mommy sometimes cried when she talked about him, but they were at that perfect age where they could sense that Grandma needed extra hugs and they were happy to provide them. Watching Lauren teach Emma to collect shells on the beach, seeing Jackson fall asleep in my lap after a long day of sightseeing, I felt something uncurl in my heart that had been wound tight since the day I'd walked into that bedroom in Tucson. My family wasn't what I thought it was, but maybe it was something better, honest, chosen, built on truth rather than deception. I also, surprisingly, made new friends, real ones this time, people I met through the foundation work or the neighborhood or the book club I joined at the Savannah Public Library. There was Patricia Chin, who'd become more than just the property manager and evolved into a genuine friend who understood what I'd survived. There was Ruth Martinez, a retired federal judge who lived 3 houses down from me and shared my passion for mystery novels and strong coffee. There was the entire team at the foundation, especially our lead investigator Simone Jackson, who'd lost her own brother to a defective medical device and understood the particular grief of preventable death caused by corporate greed. These relationships felt different from what I'd had before, lighter somehow, because they weren't weighted down with surveillance and deception. When I told Ruth about my day or shared a meal with Patricia, I didn't have to wonder if they were reporting back to anyone or analyzing my mental state for signs of dangerous curiosity. They were just there because they liked me, because we enjoyed each other's company, because friendship didn't have to be complicated or strategic. The house on Whitaker Street became truly mine, filled with furniture I chose and art I loved and the kind of comfortable clutter that comes from actually living in a space rather than just occupying it. I planted a garden in the backyard with vegetables and flowers, getting my hands dirty in the Georgia soil and finding something meditative about nurturing things and watching them grow. I took a watercolor painting class at the community center and discovered I was terrible at it but enjoyed it anyway. I started volunteering at the Savannah Community Hospice, reading to patients and sitting with people who were dying and needed someone to just be present with them. That work felt important in ways I couldn't quite articulate, maybe because I understood what it meant to have your time stolen, to realize years had passed that you could never get back. If I could give someone comfort in their final days, make their last chapter a little less lonely, that felt like a way of honoring the time I'd lost and the sister who'd saved me. Dating was something I couldn't quite imagine, even though Ruth kept trying to set me up with her retired friends who she insisted were lovely men, nothing like that monster you were married to. How do you trust anyone romantically after discovering your entire marriage was an intelligence operation? How do you believe someone's really interested in you and not just gathering information or working some angle you're too naive to see? I went on exactly 2 dates, one with a retired history professor Ruth introduced me to, one with a foundation donor who asked me to dinner, and both times I spent the entire evening analyzing every word they said, looking for signs of deception, wondering what they wanted from me. It was exhausting and unfair to them, and I decided after the second awkward dinner that maybe romance just wasn't something I needed anymore. I had meaningful work, real friends, a relationship with my daughter and grandchildren that was healing slowly. Maybe that was enough. Maybe you don't get everything back after someone steals decades of your life, and that has to be okay. 2 years after Richard's conviction, I got a call from Agent Victoria Ramirez with news that made me sit down hard in my kitchen chair. Margaret, we've reopened the investigations into the other 2 whistleblower deaths that happened before Eleanor, James Chin in 2007 and Patricia Okafor in 2010. Based on Eleanor's evidence and information we extracted from Meridian's servers during our investigation, we believe both were murdered using the same methods they used on your sister. We've got enough evidence now to bring additional charges against several Meridian executives who are already serving time, and we're looking at charges against the local police officers who rushed to close those cases without proper investigation. I thought you'd want to know that Eleanor's work is still bringing justice for people, even now. I cried after that phone call, overwhelmed with grief for those families who'd lost loved ones and spent years believing the official lies, and overwhelmed with pride for my sister who'd been so thorough in documenting Meridian's patterns that she was solving murders even after her own death. The foundation grew beyond anything I'd imagined, with satellite offices opening in 6 more cities and a staff that had expanded to 34 people. We'd helped bring down 3 other pharmaceutical companies for fraud, supported 27 whistleblowers in filing complaints with federal regulators, and provided legal representation to over 200 patients harmed by defective drugs or medical devices. The work was satisfying in ways my old part-time library job had never been. Every day I was making a tangible difference, protecting people, honoring Eleanor's legacy. We established a scholarship program for nursing students interested in patient safety advocacy, funding full tuition plus living expenses for 10 students per year who committed to working in healthcare ethics after graduation. I named it the Eleanor Bennett Memorial Scholarship, and every year at the award ceremony I'd tell those young nurses about my sister, her courage, her intelligence, her unwillingness to stay silent even when silence would have kept her safe. Richard tried to appeal his conviction twice, both times arguing that Eleanor's evidence had been improperly obtained or that his trial attorney had been ineffective. Both appeals were denied, and the appellate judges actually increased his sentence by 3 years based on additional evidence of obstruction that came out during the appellate review. I didn't attend those hearings. I'd said everything I needed to say during the victim impact statement, and I refused to give him any more of my time or emotional energy. He was serving his sentence at a federal prison in Pennsylvania, which meant he was far away from anything familiar, which felt appropriate. Diane got released early for good behavior after serving 8 years, and I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to Florida and was working at a grocery store under her maiden name, trying to build a quiet anonymous life. I felt nothing about that news, not satisfaction, not anger, just indifference. She'd become irrelevant to my life, a cautionary tale about how people will betray you for surprisingly little money. The most unexpected development came from Richard himself, or rather from his attorney. 3 years into his sentence, Richard requested a meeting with me through his lawyer, saying he had information about other corporate intelligence operations that might be useful to the Foundation's work. Victoria advised against meeting with him. He's manipulative, Margaret. Whatever he wants to tell you is probably just another attempt to control you or reduce his sentence, but I was curious enough to agree, with Victoria present and the meeting recorded. Richard looked older when I saw him in the prison visitor's room, gray hair thinned to near baldness, his expensive clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his diminished frame. He didn't apologize or try to justify what he'd done. Instead, he handed me a list of 12 other corporate intelligence operatives he'd worked with over the years, people who'd been assigned to marry or befriend targets for surveillance purposes. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, his voice flat. But these people are still out there, still destroying lives the way I destroyed yours. Some of them are worse than I was. If you want to stop them, that list is a start. I took the list and passed it to Victoria, who verified that the names were genuine and the intelligence was solid. The FBI opened investigations into 7 of the 12 operatives, and 3 have been arrested so far on various charges of fraud, conspiracy, and corporate espionage. Richard didn't get any sentence reduction for cooperating. Judge Blackstone made it clear that doing one decent thing after a lifetime of cruelty didn't earn him leniency, but he seemed to accept that. I think maybe, sitting in prison with decades to reflect on what he'd done, some small part of him had developed something resembling a conscience. Or maybe he was just bored and wanted to feel important one more time. Either way, the information helped dismantle part of the corporate surveillance apparatus that had destroyed my life, and that was worth taking the meeting. Lauren and I had reached a place of genuine healing by the 4th year after the trials. She'd divorced Derek after realizing he was more interested in preserving his image of a perfect family than supporting his wife through legitimate trauma, and she'd moved to Charleston with the kids to be closer to me. We had Sunday dinners now, real ones where we cooked together and talked about everything from the kids' school drama to the Foundation's latest cases to Lauren's new relationship with a kind teacher named Marcus who made her laugh. The kids called me Grandma Maggie and spent weekends at the Whitaker Street house, using Eleanor's old library as a reading fort and helping me in the garden. Emma had inherited her great aunt's fierce sense of justice and announced at age 10 that she was going to be either a lawyer or an FBI agent when she grew up, so she could arrest bad guys like the ones who hurt Grandma. Watching my granddaughter process what had happened to our family and emerge determined to fight for justice felt like Eleanor's legacy extending into a 3rd generation. The foundation work continued expanding, and I found myself becoming a voice for victims of corporate fraud and a sought-after speaker on healthcare ethics and patient safety. Universities invited me to give lectures, healthcare conferences wanted me on panels, congressional committees asked me to testify about pharmaceutical industry oversight. It was strange being a public figure at 66 years old, having spent most of my adult life trying to be small and unobtrusive, but I discovered I was actually good at it. I could tell Eleanor's story in a way that made people pay attention, could explain complex fraud schemes in language regular people understood, could articulate why patient safety had to matter more than corporate profits. Eleanor would have been better at it. She'd always been more articulate, more naturally authoritative, but I was doing my best to be the voice she never got to have, saying the things she died trying to expose. 5 years after finding that suitcase under my motel bed, I stood in the Eleanor Bennett Foundation's main conference room surrounded by 34 staff members, a dozen advisory board members including Victoria Ramirez, and 27 whistleblowers we'd helped protect and support through their cases. We were celebrating the Foundation's 5th anniversary, and the news that our work had contributed to $8.9 billion in fines against pharmaceutical companies, resulted in 43 criminal convictions, and helped change federal regulations around drug safety reporting. Patricia Chin had made a slideshow of our accomplishments, and watching it felt surreal, seeing how much had grown from Eleanor's evidence and her gift to me. The money she'd left me, combined with the settlement funds, had created something that would outlast both of us, protecting people for generations to come. That, I realized, was the real fortune Eleanor had promised, not the dollars in the trust fund, but the freedom and power to make a difference, to transform tragedy into purpose. Lauren stood up to say a few words, her voice steady and proud. My grandmother Eleanor, who I never got to meet, died fighting for what was right. My mother Margaret, who I'm privileged to know and love, survived a conspiracy designed to silence her and turned her pain into protection for thousands of people. I grew up believing a lie, but I'm raising my children in truth, teaching them that it's never too late to fight back, that resilience matters more than perfection, and that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates, it's about showing up honestly for the people you love. Mom, I'm so proud of who you've become, and I think Aunt Eleanor would be too. I cried, of course, because even after 5 years of healing I was still a woman who'd lost decades to deception, and sometimes the grief of that loss hit me unexpectedly. But they were different tears than the ones I'd cried in that motel room, not tears of despair but tears of gratitude that I'd survived, that I'd found Eleanor's gift, that I'd chosen to fight instead of disappear. The truth about that $100,000 in the suitcase was that it was never really about the money. It was about Eleanor saying, "You matter. You're worth protecting, you deserve better than what they did to you." It was about giving me options when I'd had none, power when I'd been powerless, hope when I'd felt hopeless. The real fortune was the life I'd built after hitting bottom, the foundation that bore Eleanor's name, the genuine relationships I'd formed, the reconciliation with my daughter, the grandchildren who knew their grandmother as strong rather than broken. I'd lost 37 years to Richard's lies and spent 62 years believing I was just ordinary Margaret with an ordinary life. But I'd discovered in my 60s that I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined, leading an organization, speaking truth to power, rebuilding from ashes, choosing courage when it would have been easier to hide. Sometimes, late at night in my beautiful house that Eleanor had prepared for me, I'd think about the woman I was in that motel room, counting dollars to figure out if I could afford both rent and food, believing Richard when he'd said I'd never be anything but a failure. I wished I could go back and tell her what was coming, that she'd find the suitcase, that she'd discover she had a sister who loved her enough to plan for her protection years in advance, that she'd transform from victim to advocate, that she'd create something meaningful from the wreckage of her life. But maybe she wouldn't have believed me. Maybe you have to go through the fire to understand what you're made of, have to hit bottom to learn you can climb back up stronger than you were before. The Desert Rose Inn, room 11, that horrible place where I'd felt so utterly defeated, had actually been the location of my rebirth. Eleanor's gift hadn't just given me money, it had given me truth, and truth had given me freedom, and freedom had let me become who I was always meant to be. I still attended every trial and sentencing hearing related to pharmaceutical fraud cases the Foundation helped develop. I still read every report our investigators filed, reviewed every grant application for the scholarship program, personally called every whistleblower we worked with to make sure they felt supported and protected. The work wasn't glamorous, mostly it was spreadsheets and legal briefs and long meetings about regulatory compliance, but it mattered. Every drug that was pulled from the market because of our investigations, every doctor who was held accountable for taking bribes, every patient who got justice for being harmed by corporate greed, those were Eleanor's victories, achieved through evidence she gathered knowing she probably wouldn't live to see them used. I was just the messenger, the executor of her will, the little sister who'd finally grown up and learned how to fight. On Eleanor's birthday every year, I visited her grave in Tucson and told her about the Foundation's work, about Lauren and the kids, about how many lives her courage had saved. I'd bring flowers, the purple irises she loved, and sit on the grass talking to her headstone like she could hear me. Maybe she could, I didn't know enough about death to rule it out. We got them, Eleanor, I'd say every year. We got every single person who hurt you, and we're making sure they can't hurt anyone else. You saved me, and now we're saving others. I hope wherever you are, you know it was all worth it. The stone never answered, of course, but the wind through the cemetery trees sounded sometimes like agreement, like Eleanor's voice saying she was proud of me, that she'd known I had this strength in me all along even when I didn't see it myself. The last time I saw Richard was at a clemency hearing 4 years into his sentence, where he was trying to argue for early release based on his cooperation with investigators. I didn't speak at the hearing, I'd said everything I needed to say years ago, but I sat in the gallery where he could see me, wanting him to know I was still here, still standing, still strong. The clemency was denied, and as they let him back to prison, his eyes found mine across the courtroom one final time. I don't know what he was looking for, forgiveness, acknowledgement, some sign that I was still the broken woman he'd left in that motel. What he got instead was a slight nod from me, not of forgiveness but of finality, a wordless communication that said you don't matter to me anymore, you're just a cautionary tale I tell to warn others. His face crumpled slightly, and I realized that his irrelevance to my life was probably worse punishment than any prison sentence could be. At 67 years old, I've lived more in the past 5 years than I did in the previous 62. I've traveled to 12 countries speaking about pharmaceutical ethics, testified before Congress 4 times, been featured in documentaries about corporate fraud, and written a book about Eleanor's case that became a bestseller and was optioned for a limited series. I've learned that you can start over at any age, that loss doesn't have to define you, that the people who try to destroy you sometimes just make you stronger. I have a life full of purpose and meaning, work that matters, relationships built on truth rather than surveillance. The desert rose and is still standing in Tucson, still charging by the week for rooms that smell like despair, but I'm not there anymore. I'm here, in this beautiful house my sister prepared for me, doing work that honors her memory, raising grandchildren who know their great-aunt was a hero, living the life she made possible through her courage and foresight. The real fortune wasn't the money in the suitcase or the trust fund or even the settlement, though all of that helped enormously and I won't pretend otherwise. The real fortune was discovering that I was stronger than the people who tried to break me, that I could transform betrayal into purpose, that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Eleanor gave me the tools, but I did the work. I climbed out of that motel room, built something meaningful from nothing, refused to let Richard and Diane and Meridian have the final word on who Margaret Bennett was or what her life would mean. Every patient we protect through the Foundation, every whistleblower we support, every corrupt executive we help bring to justice, those are all victories against the people who thought they could silence Eleanor and control me. They failed spectacularly, and that failure is the sweetest fortune of all. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.